So we've all seen that in 2022, the end of 2021 and all of 2022, we've seen these dramatic increases in the global price of gas. That for a variety of reasons, one of the main ones has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the basically shutting off of gas supplies to Europe, which has led to global shortages and global increases. Now, this has fed through into domestic energy prices as well. So in the UK, we've seen a situation where this October, this time next month, the price that people pay for domestic energy will be more than twice as high as what it was 1 year ago in October 2021. So the price has essentially risen by 100%. And of course, when the energy price rises like that, we also see increases in energy poverty as well. So situations where people can't afford to use the energy that they need to in their home to maintain a decent standard of living, essentially. So we have some predictions that say we could actually have more or close to 50% of all households in the UK living in energy poverty after these price increases. So this is a really, really serious situation. And the UK is in an especially vulnerable position as well, for a number of reasons. First of all, because we are heavily reliant on gas, both for our electricity and also for our heating in our homes as well. So the vast majority of homes in the UK are heated using natural gas through a central heating type system. And gas also makes up, it varies a bit, but typically it's around about 40% of our electricity generation comes from gas. So we have a heavy reliance on it. We also have a very energy inefficient housing stock. So this map here just basically illustrates that point. So it's showing if a temperature is 20 degrees inside.
I'm sorry, Neil. I'm sorry
to
interrupt, but we cannot see your map. Your presentation is just on the first slide.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Let me stop sharing and see if I can fix this. I've never used Google Meets before, so I'm not entirely sure how to use it. Let me try sharing this. How about now? Can you see it now?
Yes, now it's perfect.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. I must have pressed the wrong setting. So yeah, so what you can see from the map here is that basically UK homes lose heat much more quickly compared to countries in the rest of Europe. So we have Belgium and France that are maybe similar to us, but a lot of the countries in Scandinavia, in Germany, they have much more efficient homes. So their homes are better insulated. If it's cold outside, they maintain the heat inside for longer. Our homes leak heat, so therefore they need to use more gas to heat them. And also, we've had a decade in the UK of neoliberal austerity. And over that period, we've had stagnating incomes for lower middle income. In some cases, people on low incomes have actually seen an income fall over the last decade. So essentially, people have been getting poorer in financial terms. So all of these things kind of come together alongside the global increase in gas prices and rising energy prices domestically to create what some people have called a humanitarian crisis, essentially. So if we don't do something about this and provide some immediate support to people to enable them to pay their energy bills over the coming winter, we're going to have essentially a public health disaster when there's a real risk that we'll have tens of thousands of people that actually die this winter simply because they can't afford to keep their home warm. So that's the context, and there has been much debate in the UK about, okay, we know we need to do something. What is it that we should actually do, and what's the best approach that we can take? So in the longer term, of course, the answer is that we need to insulate our homes so they're much more like Norway or Germany, and they lose heat much less than they currently do. We need to move away from gas towards renewable energy, But this winter, we also need to provide some immediate financial support to people so that they're going to be able to afford to pay their bills this winter. And really the best way of doing that, I suppose, is what I'm going to be focusing on in this talk. So the debate I would like to focus on particularly is in providing financial assistance or assistance in enabling energy to be more affordable for people. Should we be adopting an approach based on universalism or targeting? Okay, so universalism is basically an approach where all citizens in a country, rich or poor, are eligible for support. So examples of this would be the government providing financial payments to everyone, kind of like a form of universal basic income, I suppose. Or it would be where, for example, the government caps the price of energy at a particular level, stop it becoming too expensive, and the government funds the kind of losses that energy companies make, for example. Targeting is an approach to social policy where you only provide assistance to those people who meet a set of kind of specified criteria. Okay, so an example of that would be what are called social energy tariffs, where you provide cheaper energy to people that meet a kind of threshold, like that, for example, they're claiming means tested benefits, they're on a low income, or alternatively, you provide direct financial payments, but only to particular eligible groups rather than to all your citizens. So this has been a debate that's been playing out in the UK media. What I would say is that most think tanks, political commentators, most people in the media class tend to favor the targeting approach. Okay, so it's sort of saying that we should only be providing assistance to specified groups, people on low income who are deemed to be more vulnerable to energy poverty. And the way the debate is played out in the media and is often talked about among these think tanks and fuel poverty charities basically looks like this. So if we have this table which has the pros and the cons of targeting and universalism, and people often talk about the pros of targeting, so the good aspects of targeting. One is that it seems to be fairer. So it's in terms of energy justice, it's closer to that because you're giving more resources to the poorest. It's also seen as being cheaper. So it has less financial cost to the state. So you're not giving money to everyone, you're focusing it. Of course, it's going to be cheaper. So it's seen as being a more efficient use of financial resources. And then often we also talk about the negative aspects of universalism as well. So this, for example, is what's called, one of the main points here, is what's called inclusion errors. So the idea that with universalism, you end up spending a lot of money providing support to people who are ultimately deemed not to need it. So you're giving financial support to the very rich who aren't in energy poverty, and they don't really need it, right? So that's a waste of money. It's also seen as being very financially expensive. So it takes a lot of state resources to be able to afford these policies. And this is the way the debate is often talked about in the UK media. And I just got a quick example here. So the person here on the right, he is the leader of the main opposition political party in the UK, the Labour Party. And they came out with a policy announcement about a month or so ago where they said what their approach to dealing with this problem would be that they would cap energy prices, domestic energy prices, where they currently are this winter, and they would fund the difference and ensure that energy companies didn't go bust by a windfall tax that they would put on oil and gas producers. So the leader of the Labour Party here comes onto this talk show and he's being interviewed. And one of the things the interviewer criticized him for or pressed him on was the point he's making here. So you are giving money to millionaires, okay, and you're perfectly happy with that. So this is an example of this inclusion error, this idea that why are we giving money to people that are very rich and are seen as not really needing it? My response to this, I suppose, is that yes, inclusion errors are an issue, but there's another type of error that we ought to be more concerned about, in my view, and this is what's called exclusion errors. So basically, you are excluding people who actually do need help. So inclusion errors is when you end up providing assistance to people who don't really need it. Exclusion errors is the opposite side. So you target support narrowly, but you end up actually excluding people who do actually need help. They just don't meet the eligibility criteria that you set when you designed your targeted approach. So I would ask you all, which of these do you think is worse? And I think, to me, from a perspective of justice and trying to help people who are in need, actually the second one is worse, excluding people who actually need assistance. So I showed you the table before, which sort of gave a partial view of the pros and cons of targeting and universalism. I think if we took a fuller picture and actually looked at this more in the round, we will get a balanced approach. So if we take targeting approaches, so only looking at those in need and providing financial assistance to them, we talked about the potential benefits of that, but what are the downsides? So the big downsides are these types of exclusion errors that I talked about before. So the fact that you try and target and you end up excluding people who actually need help. And this can happen for all sorts of reasons. One of them is it's actually very difficult to define who's actually in need. So if we take the example of fuel poverty, in the UK, there's lots of different ways that we can define who the fuel poor are. And depending on how we define fuel poverty, we have a different set of groups that are identified as being vulnerable and as being in need. So depending on how we define the problem, how we define fuel poverty or how we define vulnerability, which is always partly subjective, we end up excluding people that, if we'd happened to use a different definition, would actually be eligible for support. The second factor that we always have to consider is incomplete data. So often we could come up with the best definition we possibly could, but then actually being able to identify those people and ensure that we reach them in terms of support is often very difficult because we simply don't have the data available to be able to reach those people. A third factor is that often in targeting approaches, you do it through a means tested approach. So it basically means that people have to apply for support themselves. They fill out an application form, they have to apply, provide evidence in order to receive the benefits. But we know that one of the reasons some of the most vulnerable people tend not to apply for these types of schemes is simply because they find the application process extremely complex. So for example, if they're from an ethnic minority group, if their first language isn't English, applying for a scheme like this can be very difficult. And finally, we also know that some people are put off applying for targeted social policy simply because it's seen as being stigmatizing. So when you target a particular group of people, you mark them out as different, you say they're different to the rest of society, that creates a stigmatization process and that puts off people from applying. Alternatively, if we look at universalism approaches, yes, we have the problem of inclusion errors. So maybe we include the millionaires, but the benefit is that we reach everybody. So we reach everyone that actually needs help because we're not asking them to apply. There's no stigma attached. We don't need to try and define who's vulnerable. So we reach everyone who's in need. Universalist approaches also promote social solidarity. So when something becomes a universal right that you get, whether you're rich or you're poor, this reduces this issue of, what's the best way of putting it? I suppose social tension that you might get when some people in society are seen as receiving help and some people aren't. And you get people maybe on the margins of eligibility that are saying, hang on, I really need some support from the state, but I'm not eligible for it. Why are those people? And you create this stigmatization process. You create this process of social division. And then finally, universalist policies also tend to be better protected politically. And what I mean by that is that politicians find them more difficult to actually get rid of in comparison to targeted approaches, because everyone in society gets them. It's seen as being a universal right, so therefore it's not so easy for politicians to actually take it away. So one of the possible proposals that we might have for a universal policy to deal with the energy price crisis would be to do what the Labour Party actually said, which is to have a price freeze and say prices can't rise any higher than they currently are, and the government will cover the losses of energy companies to ensure that they don't go bust. So how could we actually make that a kind of progressive policy? So we have this issue of an inclusion error. We're giving money to millionaires. That doesn't seem to be very fair. Well, actually, there's a very, very simple way that you could make this progressive, and it would be to fund that policy through tax increases on the very rich. Okay, so you could fund it through windfall taxes on oil and gas companies. You could fund it through wealth taxes on people who are very wealthy and own lots of property, and you could fund it through income tax increases on high earners. And this would actually be the most simple way. You adopt a universal policy, you fund it through increasing taxes on the richest to actually make this progressive. So yes, some of the rich actually receive benefits from this price freeze, but the benefits they receive are offset by the tax increases that they actually have to get. So it's very simple. You could do that. One of the reasons that it's not is that it's often deemed too politically sensitive to do it. So I don't know what the situation is like in Brazil, but here in the UK, if any political parties ever actually talk about increasing taxes, that is basically seen as being, let's say, a way to ensure that you're not particularly popular and you don't win elections. So as a quick example, just before I wrap up, there is a think tank in the UK called the Resolution Foundation, and they brought out a report saying, okay, how can we deal with these energy price increases? They actually recognized that the simplest way of doing this would be through a universal price increase and raising taxes, a universal price freeze and increasing taxes on the richest. They recognized that that was actually the most simple and straightforward way of doing it. But they said, no way would any political party ever agree to this. So what they actually proposed instead was this idea of a social tariff, where you offer a lower price of energy for the poorest third of the population, they said. But when you looked at the detail of what they were proposing, it was a hugely complicated system. It would require having to set up an entirely new means-tested benefit system with a huge amount of bureaucracy and administration that would go with that. And it would require households to actually actively apply to get that support as well. And I talked before about some of the problems that you get as soon as you start asking people to apply for schemes. But basically the point is, raising taxes was seen by the Resolution Foundation as so politically difficult that they actually proposed a social tariff, even though that simply having a universalist approach would be a more simple, straightforward policy. How much longer have I got? I don't know if I've got much time to talk about this, but maybe just take a couple of minutes. So one quick example of what I think might be a good solution to take is this idea of universal basic energy. So maybe this is actually an alternative to a price freeze. So the idea of universal basic energy is that every citizen and every household in a particular country receives a free allowance of energy. So the first, say, 2,000 or 2 kilowatt hours that they use per year in their home, they get for free and they have no charge. The energy that they use above their free allowance is charged at a progressively more expensive rate. So what that would mean is, if you are a household who uses lots of energy, you would end up being charged at the higher unit rate than a household that's using very, very little. Okay, so the clear benefits of doing this is, first of all, that it's universalist and it's simplistic. It asserts energy as a basic right for all citizens. It ensures that people who are on very low incomes or use very little energy can at least afford to keep their homes warm, and they can afford to use energy to a basic level at little or no cost. At the same time, it ensures that high energy users, which also tend to be people who are on higher incomes, are actually incentivized to reduce their consumption, or if they don't reduce it, they have to pay a higher cost for that. And as a result, it's also progressive, because ultimately it helps, on the whole, the poorest more than it helps the richest, because the richest tend to be higher consumers. So as I see it, this seems to be an excellent potential idea that we should take forward, potentially not this winter, but maybe looking into the future. One of the challenges, or the main challenge as I see it with this policy, is how we actually account though for differing energy needs. And what I mean by that is that, as I said, people who consume lots of energy are normally the richest. People who consume little energy are normally the poorest, but it's not always the case. And you do have examples of people on very low incomes who actually consume lots of domestic energy in their home, for example, because they're living in a very inefficient dwelling, or, for example, they may have a health condition or a disability that requires them to use the heating more than the average person. So the main challenge, as I see it, is how do we deal with that? How do we ensure that people who are on low incomes but have to use lots of energy for reasons beyond their control, how do we ensure that they aren't penalized and they don't lose out from this policy? So a good idea in principle, I would say, we just need to work out the details. So I just want to conclude with some final thoughts. I would say that on balance, I generally favor universalism over targeted approaches for dealing with the energy crisis. But I would also say that in many ways, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. And you could have an approach where you actually combine both of them. So for example, you have some universalist system and you have targeting for providing extra support for people who are in the most difficult circumstances. So I guess I would wonder, I don't know if we'll have time for discussion, but which do you guys prefer? What do you think about the universal basic energy idea? And I'll finally finish as well by just saying that I never want to miss what is actually the real long-term solutions to this crisis. And that isn't about financial payment. That's actually about, as I said earlier, it's about energy efficiency. It's about low carbon heating, so getting away from gas, and it's about adopting renewable energy. So those are some references if anyone wants to follow them up after the seminar. And I'll just finish it there and just say thank you for listening, and thank you to the funders as well, who've kind of inspired some of the research that's gone into this talk.